In 2001, a couple named Charlie Burrell and Isabella stood on the edge of 3,500 acres of exhausted farmland in West Sussex, England, land that Burrell's family had owned for over 200 years, and made a decision that their neighbors thought was insane. They stopped farming, they removed every internal fence. They broke up the Victorian drainage systems that had been channeling water off the fields for a century. They released herds of free-roaming longhorn cattle, Exmoor ponies, Tamworth pigs, and 3 species of deer onto the land. And then they did the one thing that no one in British agriculture could believe. They stepped back and let nature take over. By 2025, ecological surveys conducted across the estate, now known as the Knepp Wildland, documented recovery that even the project's own founders had not imagined possible. Breeding bird numbers had increased by 916%. Nightingale territories had risen from 9 singing males in 1999 to 62, a 500% increase on an estate that had recorded just 1 nightingale territory in its 2005 baseline survey. Turtle dove numbers, a species that has declined by 98% across Britain, had risen 600%, making Knepp possibly the only piece of land in the country where their numbers are going up. Butterfly species richness had doubled. Dragonfly and damselfly abundance had increased by 871%. The estate now holds one of the largest populations of purple emperor butterflies in the United Kingdom, with 283 individuals counted in a single day in 2025. White storks bred successfully at Knepp in 2020, the first time the species had nested in Britain since 1416. By 2024, 53 chicks fledged from the colony. Beavers were reintroduced in 2022. All 5 species of British owl now breed on the estate, along with 13 of the country's 18 bat species, including 2 of the rarest. What was, 25 years ago, a failing commercial farm that Isabella described as a biological desert is now one of the most significant biodiversity hotspots in Britain, and the method that produced it cost less than the farming it replaced. This is that story. This is the full story, from the financial collapse that forced a 200-year-old family farm to abandon conventional agriculture, to the radical ecological theory that suggested an alternative to what 25 years of monitoring data are now revealing about what happens when you return large herbivores to exhausted European farmland and let natural processes run without human direction. Most videos about rewilding show you a pretty landscape and call it progress. This one follows the data 25 years deep into the soil biology, the breeding bird transects, the butterfly surveys, the carbon sequestration measurements, the white stork reintroduction that brought a species back to Britain after a 600-year absence, and the scientific evidence that is only now quantifying what happens when you stop managing land and start letting animals manage it instead. Every claim in this video is sourced from Knepp Estate's official monitoring program, the 2026 2-decade ecological review, and the Knepp Wildland Carbon Project by Queen Mary University of London. This is not speculation. This is what 25 years of systematic field surveys actually document. But before you can understand what is happening at Knepp now, you need to understand what the land looked like before, and why the decision to stop farming, it was not idealism, it was desperation. For Americans, the scale of what happened at Knepp requires a specific frame of reference. Britain is a small, intensively farmed country. Nearly 70% of its land is agricultural. The average British farm is roughly 215 acres, less than a third of the size of the average American farm. Knepp, at 3,500 acres, is large by British standards, roughly 5.5 square miles, but by American standards, it is a single, mid-sized ranch. What makes Knepp extraordinary is not its size. It is what happened on that small piece of ground when the owners stopped fighting the soil and let the animals take over. Charlie Burrell inherited the estate in 1985 at the age of 21. It was a conventional dairy and arable farm with winter wheat, barley, oats, maize, and a herd of dairy cattle working heavy-wheeled clay soil that had never been naturally productive. The clay was cold, wet, and stubborn. Yields were consistently below national averages. The farm survived on subsidies, not profit. Burrell spent 15 years trying to make it work, investing in new equipment, trying new crop rotations, and draining fields more aggressively. By 2000, the estate was losing serious money. The economics of industrial farming on marginal English clay had reached a dead end. But here is what makes the Knepp story different from a simple farm closure. Burrell and Tree did not sell the land. They did not convert it to housing development. They did not plant it with commercial forestry. Instead, they looked at what the land was doing, failing at agriculture, and asked a question that almost no one in British farming was asking in 2001. What would this land do if we stopped telling it what to be? Later in this video, you will see exactly what the land decided to become when the animals were released and the fences came down. The speed and scale of the ecological transformation is unlike anything British conservation had documented on former farmland. But first, you need to understand the theory that made Knepp possible, because without it, the project would have had no scientific foundation and no chance of approval. The intellectual engine behind Knepp is a hypothesis proposed by a Dutch ecologist named Frans Vera in his 2000 book Grazing Ecology and Forest History. Vera's argument was radical and, for many ecologists, heretical. The conventional view of European ecology holds that the natural landscape of lowland Europe before human agriculture was closed canopy forest. Remove humans, the thinking goes, and the trees take over. Vera disagreed. He argued that prehistoric Europe was not a closed forest, but a dynamic mosaic of open grassland, scrub, and woodland, maintained not by humans, but by large herbivores. Aurochs, wild horses, elk, deer, and wild boar, the megafauna that roamed Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, kept the landscape open through grazing, browsing, trampling, and rooting. They created clearings, they maintained grasslands, they opened the canopy, and in doing so, they generated the kind of habitat complexity that supports the highest levels of biodiversity, not the deep, dark, closed forest that most ecologists assumed was the European default. Vera's hypothesis was controversial. It still is. But Burrell and Tree saw something in it that no one else had tried to test at scale in Britain. If you put large herbivores back onto exhausted farmland and remove the fences, the drainage, and the management, if you let the animals create the landscape instead of humans designing it, what happens? What happened next took roughly 5 years to become visible, and it produced a landscape that no one had seen in southern England in living memory. The first animals released were English longhorn cattle, chosen not for their productivity, but for their behavior. They are a hardy, slow-growing breed that browses scrub and rough vegetation rather than requiring manicured pasture. Exmoor ponies followed, a breed descended from wild tarpans, the prehistoric horses of Europe, and one of the closest living approximations to the animals that once maintained open landscapes across the continent. Tamworth pigs, long-snouted, semi-feral animals bred from Old English stock, were released to act as the rooting, soil-disturbing equivalent of wild boar, an animal that cannot legally be released in England. Red, roe, and fallow deer completed the herbivore assemblage. All internal gates and fences were removed. The animals were free to go wherever they wanted on the estate at any time. What the animals did was not what conventional land management would have predicted. The cattle did not create uniform pasture. The ponies did not mow the grass flat. The pigs did not destroy the fields. Instead, each species interacted with the landscape differently, and those interactions created what ecologists call habitat heterogeneity. The pigs rootled through the soil with their snouts, turning over earth, creating bare patches that filled with pioneer plants and insect communities. The cattle grazed selectively, leaving some areas tall and others short, creating structure. The ponies browsed scrub that the cattle would not touch. The deer moved through the emerging woodland, preventing any single vegetation type from dominating. Within 5 years, the orderly arable fields had transformed into a patchwork of tangled thickets, rough grassland, pioneer woodland, and standing deadwood that no human had planned. Isabella Tree described it as a kaleidoscopic landscape, constantly shifting, driven by animal behavior rather than human design. and providing the kind of structural diversity that industrial farmland eliminates entirely. And then the wildlife arrived. But the biggest surprise was not that wildlife returned, it was what returned and how fast. The nightingale is one of Britain's most endangered songbirds, a species in catastrophic decline across the country, associated with dense scrub habitat that modern agriculture systematically removes. At Knepp, where thorny scrub was now growing unchecked across hundreds of acres, nightingale numbers exploded, from a single territory in 2005 to 62 singing males by 2025. The thorny thickets that neighbors had complained about, the bramble, blackthorn, and hawthorn that conventional farmers consider weeds, turned out to be, in trees' words, rocket fuel for songbirds. The scrub provided nesting protection, seed resources, insect habitat, and the dense structure that nightingales specifically require. The same pattern repeated across species after species. Turtle doves, which have declined by 98% in Britain since the 1970s and are functionally disappearing from the country, went from 2 singing males in 2008 to 23 in 2020 and 22 in 2024. Knepp is now probably the only site in Britain where turtle dove numbers are consistently rising. Peregrine falcons began breeding on the estate. Ravens returned. Red kites, sparrowhawks, lesser spotted woodpeckers, skylarks, yellowhammers, species that had either been absent or barely present, established breeding populations. And that is where the story gets truly interesting. Because what the monitoring data revealed was not just a species list getting longer, it was an entire ecosystem assembling itself, without a plan, without a target species list, without anyone deciding what should go where, in response to nothing more than the physical disturbance patterns of free-roaming herbivores on exhausted farmland. The first surprise was entomological. The purple emperor butterfly, one of Britain's most elusive and spectacular insects, a large iridescent species that feeds on sap, carrion, and animal dung rather than flowers, appeared at Knepp in numbers that stunned entomologists. The species depends on sallow, a type of willow, for breeding, and sallow proliferated across the estate as scrub expanded. By 2025, Knepp held one of the largest purple emperor populations in the United Kingdom. 283 individuals were counted in a single day. For a butterfly that most British naturalists consider themselves lucky to see once in a lifetime, the concentration was unprecedented. Dragonfly and damselfly populations surged by 871% after the Victorian drainage systems were broken up and natural water flows returned to the estate. Rare invertebrates, including saproxylic beetles that depend on dead and decaying wood, species not recorded in West Sussex for 50 years, were rediscovered breeding on standing deadwood that conventional forestry would have removed. The violet door beetle, a dung specialist, appeared in numbers not seen in the region for decades, thriving on the vast quantities of wild herbivore dung now distributed across the landscape. And that was only the invertebrate story. What happened above the waterline was something else entirely. In 2016, the Knepp team began a formal reintroduction of white storks, a species that had not bred in Britain since a pair nested on St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh in 1416. 600 years of absence. Working with the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation, Warsaw Zoo, and Cotswold Wildlife Park, they established non-flying storks in a predator-proof enclosure on the estate to act as a colony anchor, a social magnet that would attract wild migratory storks passing through southern England each spring. In 2020, the first 2 wild pairs nested and bred successfully. It was the first white stork breeding in Britain in over 6 centuries. By 2024, 53 chicks fledged from the growing colony. By 2025, 23 nests were active, holding 86 eggs. Young storks that had fledged from Knepp were migrating to Morocco, Spain, and France, and some had already returned as adults to breed at the estate, completing the migratory cycle for the first time. Knepp has since been named a European stork village by Euronature, joining 15 other official stork villages across the continent. For Americans, imagine a single ranch in Texas bringing back a species that had not nested in the state since the 1400s, and doing it within 4 years of starting. The full dimensions of Knepp's ecological transformation are still being measured. A landmark report by Queen Mary University of London and Arup, the Knepp Wildland Carbon Project, confirmed that the estate's rewilded soils are now sequestering carbon at rates comparable to native woodlands. Soil microbial biomass has increased by 125% compared to the surrounding arable land. The organic matter content of the soil, the foundation of soil fertility, water retention, and carbon storage, has risen measurably in just 2 decades. For a country where 70% of the land is farmed and where soil degradation is a national crisis, this is not an academic finding. It is a proof of concept that has implications for every marginal farm in Britain. The third surprise was economic. Conventional wisdom holds that rewilding is a luxury, something rich landowners do when they no longer need to make money from the land. Knepp disproved this. The estate now generates revenue from multiple streams that did not exist under conventional farming. Wild-range pasture-fed meat from the free-roaming herds, sold primarily to London-based customers through the estate's own butchery, safari-style ecotourism with glamping, camping, and guided wildlife walks that attract tens of thousands of visitors per year, biodiversity net gain credits sold to developers who need to offset the ecological impact of construction projects elsewhere, and carbon credits from the measured sequestration in rewilded soils. The estate is now more profitable than it ever was as a conventional farm. It employs more people across more diverse roles than the dairy and arable operation it replaced. For American ranchers and farmers on marginal land, and there are millions of acres of marginal agricultural land in the United States, from the played-out cotton fields of the Southeast to the overgrazed rangelands of the West, Knepp offers a template that is not theoretical. It is operational. It is profitable, and it works on land that conventional agriculture had already given up on. The village of Storrington, just south of the estate, carries a name that is itself a fossil. Storrington derives from the Saxon Estorshestone, the village of the storks. For 600 years, that name described a bird that no one living in the village had ever seen. The storks were gone. The name remained. Now, white storks circle on thermals above Knepp's ancient oaks, bill clattering on nests built in the same trees where medieval birds may once have nested. And the village that carries the stork's name in its own identity can see the animal from its doorsteps again. 3,500 acres. A decision made in financial desperation by a couple who could not make their farm pay. Free-roaming cattle, ponies, pigs, and deer were released onto exhausted clay fields. No targets, no species lists, no management plan beyond letting the animals create the landscape. And 25 years later, one of the most significant biodiversity hotspots in Britain, built not by conservation managers, but by the animals themselves, doing what large herbivores have done across Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, creating the habitat complexity that everything else depends on. But England is not the only place where a returned species is reshaping a landscape in ways scientists did not predict. In our next video, we go to Idaho, where in 1948, a state wildlife officer threw 76 live beavers out of an airplane with surplus World War II parachutes, dropped them into a valley that would become one of America's largest protected wilderness areas, and accidentally started an ecosystem restoration experiment that has been running uninterrupted for 77 years. If you thought letting animals loose on a dead English farm was a gamble, wait until you see what 76 parachuting beavers did to 2.3 million acres of American wilderness when nobody was watching. You will not look at conservation the same way again.